Some of the stuff that I was specifically interested in was, I think, like, even just how you were reflecting on stuff around the Convergence Center, for example, and, like, you know,
Part of that I was talking about.
or just, like, that era, you know, like,
Yeah.
that particular kind of time period.
Right.
And part of that, like, I think I was saying in the text message was, like, was thinking about, like, how people's ideas change and kind of take different forms, and some of that, I think, like, includes how you see other people, and then maybe also, like, how you fit, right? Or, like, don't fit, or, you know, so I was trying to see all those things as being connected in a way, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. And do you know, like, what, like, what's your, like, sort of guiding question on this project?
I mean, I think that my guiding question in some way still is around whether or not people feel that, well, there's the question, you know, do you feel like you're a race traitor, which changed pretty quickly.
Well, I mean, I guess my relationship to it comes from, like, white anti-racist organizing and the concept of, I guess, disidentifying with whiteness in some capacity, but as an ally. It's not exactly disidentifying, right? But anyway, so, I mean, like, the idea that one doesn't stay in their lane, you know, and, like, in some way, like, because still there's something through, like, dominant culture and social structures that assume that we will socialize and be with people of our own race, despite all the excitement about people being mixed race and mixed ethnic kids now or whatever, you know. So I think that the idea of being a race traitor is not sticking within that, you know, like the rigid expectation of who you're supposed to associate with and socialize with. And then also, though, it has to have a political edge to it, would be my thought. So that there's a consciousness to what one's doing to, like, address, like, you know, systemic racial inequalities.
And then, I mean, I guess in regards to the disidentifying, you talked about how that was something you had written about while you were working on your grad thesis, I think, right?
Yeah, in cultural studies.
And yeah, I don't know if you have, like, a little bit to share about what you wrote during that time period specifically.
Yeah. And so I was writing and making a video because I definitely don't only think through writing. And so I was interested in, it was at the time of the WTO protests in Seattle. So it was 1999, and it was in the era of the anti-corporate globalization resistance stuff going on. And I got really fascinated with this anxiety around anarchist demonstrators that was coming up in, like, the news media, you know, like, from, like, it was interesting to me from, like, having, like, been, like, you know, like a punk kid and, like, anarchism and squatting and all that kind of stuff, right? But it was, like, such a, like, subculture, and then all of a sudden there's, like, a group of protesters that people understand and know about and are calling anarchists, and they're reporting on it, like, all over the media. And so it felt to me like it was sort of like literally had been a century since people had actually had a fear of anarchists on that kind of level, you know. And so I was like, what does that mean? Like, what does that actually mean? Because because you know, whatever, like, anarchism is an actual movement. It's really different than calling oneself an anarchist and sort of saying fuck you to everything around you, you know. So then when I lived in Los Angeles, there was a series, like it was a 3-night series on KCOP, K-Cop. And it was the anarchists are coming to LA. And I was like so fascinated by it because it used all these like racialized tropes of blackness to create fear amongst this group of people and to create them as outsiders that were going to come in and be violent and fuck with your city and fuck with your neighborhood and you better protect your property and you better protect your family. But, you know, I'm like, it's like, I mean, it's like in a sense how great if demonstrators, you know, if our protests actually really did take the system down in such a way that there was that great of a fear, but you know, it felt really like it was using these racialized tropes to create just as a mediated fear, you know. So that was interesting to me because that's like one level of thinking about this group of people are coming in, but at that time period and particularly coming up from, there was a lot of around the Eugene anarchists and Oregon and stuff like that, like that. So it's like predominantly like young white people, right? And young white people donning black masks and wearing all black. And so then there's this fear of them as black, but they're actually young white people, right? And so on one level, there's a race traitor thing that could be going on if there's a consciousness to it. That could be interesting in terms of how one can use the racial privilege they have to maybe be in a safer place to be on the front lines of some kinds of demonstrations, right, by doing that. But at the same time, there's a blackness that's getting put on that's being feared by other people that becomes racialized, and it's not necessarily being used well unless it's conscious. So that was going on, and so I also then started talking to and interviewing anarchists of color, and then talking about like what were like what are the issues within that movement around race and how does it actually address race and racialization well, or does it not? So I was like really interested in these dual levels of, on one side, concept of being a race traitor as a white person, and then on the other side, in some ways, the concept of, I mean, is one a race traitor if they're a person of color in a predominantly white movement? Right? You know, and what does that mean? I mean, that actually goes back to the book Disidentifications and what Jose Esteban Munoz was writing about, and like being a Chicano punk and like able to like, you know, associate himself with this kind of white culture while he was, you know, having a politicized Chicano identity. So it's things like that. So those were the questions I was really interested in. I'm trying to unpack that some.
Yeah. And how do you feel about that stuff now? Like at least like those specific things, like what you were talking about in that time period.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about. Like, I would imagine I would draw some different conclusions now than I did at that time period around the possibility of donning the blackness. You know, and it's.
And when you say donning the blackness, you mean the...
So I mean black. So so that was, the fear was of the black. Right? And so what do I think about that now? It's sort of funny because I know this has kind of gone in a little different direction than we talked about originally. So I'm like, so I don't know if that quite gets over. So I want to wind
No,
I
think that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because there's ways we can also get to the other stuff.
I feel like it's related.
Okay. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is. Like, because it moves there. Because, okay, I can totally do that. So at that time period... Clap, cut, here you go. Okay, so at that time period, it, like, the discussions of race were still really black and white, actually. And especially, like, in LA, especially, like, up in the Northwest, oddly, even in LA, and I'm sure, like your experience in LA would have been different, but there was, like, an experience of... racial justice movements in a particular way that like were like what, like they were still kind of like I don't know, there's 5 races, right? There's like black, white, Chicano, Asian, Native American, that's it, right? You know, and that's the concept of U.S. racialization. And so, and so it felt like at that time period, it was still pretty much like you had to, like, you were here, you were this, if you're this, you're this, and it was a lot of visual perception, right? And there wasn't as much, like, recognition, I feel, at that moment of people of mixed ethnicities or mixed races or, you know, multi-ethnic in some capacity, and or some genealogy. And so so my conclusions about things are so different now because like discussions around racial identity are more nuanced than they were then. Although what I was working with was like trying to get to those nuanced identities, you know, and I feel like it's like that way that like academic theory and on the ground activism meet someplace, and then like they're informing each other. And so there's more of like a recognition of getting rid of the concept of like an essential racial identity, which I think some people were still kind of feeling there was some connection to an essential racial identity a bit at that time period, even though it was only like 1999 or 2000, whatever. So one would be questioned pretty heavily, like if they didn't look a particular, like what somebody would assume somebody of a race looked like. So there wasn't like the idea that somebody could be light-skinned, white-looking, and actually be of color ethnically. You know, so now I just think it's a much more nuanced conversation to think about racial identity, which also then means what's race trading. You know.
Yeah, and I guess that was my next question is like, where does that relate to race trading, if it does or
it's
if it
funny,
doesn't?
we totally have coined a term now, race trading.
I know. Now I'm just saying, it's like baiting or some, I don't even know. Yeah.
So, you want to get the shot set?
No, it's okay. You can keep talking.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I guess, like, keeping it in the context of being a race trader, I think that, like, it starts being a question to me of, like, is that a useful context? You know, like, does that start limiting a way of thinking about racial identity? Or does it offer something playful, performative? You know, I think that's what's kind of coming to mind, trying to think about what might it mean to be a race trader.
How do you think that it could be playful?
Actually, I want to move away from the examples I was thinking about with the anarchist stuff and like go someplace else with it. And I certainly don't have Jose Esteban Munoz disidentifications well enough in my head, but in that. So I think, so I want to try to like get to some like thinking of examples of that. So I think like how it can, like in a sense it's dangerous really to talk about it being playful because there's such real consequences to racial identification or perceived racial identification, right, from state violence, from, you know, vigilantism, and so it's not a dismissal of the depth of the reality, you know, of what needs to be addressed with the intense racism and white supremacy, like within our culture and what we're looking at with a lot of social justice movements right now. But at the same time, I think that the playfulness, I guess it's sort of like the playfulness of gender, actually. So like, you know, so it's like if one, like, so like I can use my own examples. Like I have had experiences of white people assuming I'm not only white, and so questioning or being interested in where I might fit in, or the kinds of like, what are you, like I have gotten those kinds of questions in my life quite a bit. And then also being in POC spaces and some people also recognizing me as not only being white. And so there's a way that, like, I don't, like, it's such a complicated history of the races and ethnicities of my family, and like where in one part of the world like racial identification is so different than here and stuff like that. So there's a way that like I can be playful with that in a choosing of what's like tactically what's important, you know, to take on an identity in the moment. You know, like I choose not to take on a being a person of color as my identity because of a lot of reasons. I mean, maybe that's part of what you want to talk about, the complications of that. But then I don't only feel like I'm only white either. And so that's actually, it can be a playful place, it can be a heavy place, and it can be a not that important place, and it can also be like an interesting, playful place of like what, you know, how important is it to be, to like have, how important is it, or I don't want to say how important is it because that starts going other places, but like there's ways to just recognize that it's racialization and not race, right? Like race is very concrete and it's a very lived experience and it exists and it's real, but also there's racialization, right? Because these aren't essential identities. They're called something here in the U.S., but they're called very different things other places, or the hierarchy of races and racialization is different in other places and ethnicities. So there's something to like, I think, remembering that too, you know, so that we don't get so, I don't know, U.S.-centric in our concepts of these things, you know, and but at the same time, like every time I say that, I can't help but saying, but at the same time, people are like murdered in the street for their race or perceived race. So, you know, like there has to be, both of those things have to be recognized.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the place that I go for, like what could be playful is that, I think that maybe part of the reason that race traitor isn't a term that really seems to what's the word I'm looking for? Like it doesn't sit well, or it doesn't
serve.
Kind of it doesn't serve to describe anyone's current lived experience as either a white or white passing person. And I think that maybe part of that reason, I can't speak for those people because I'm not white, like I don't self-identify, but I think that maybe part of the reason might be that like obviously people don't believe it, right? They don't necessarily believe it, and I'm not there to
you could be a race traitor.
I'm not there to suggest that, you know, 100 or 150 years ago, right? How was that being discussed? I don't know. We can't ask those people, right? Unfortunately. So, but at this present time, that there's sort of this like unbelievability about it or something like that. So I wonder if that part of it is that the playfulness of like pushing something, right?
Like pushing belief systems around like these absolute like that people like you're born, you're identified, this is you,
right?
You know, and so that's why I was like, it's kind of like gender, right? Like it can be much more playful, right? I mean, like we can get really focused on the like intensity of these like social identities, right? And the oppressive state of them, but there's ways that I would think it could be playful. I mean, like I don't think you should put this in it all, but like one of the places that I go to is like Rachel Dolezal.
Well, that is the complication,
right? I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's complication because like what she was doing with it was, I don't know, you know, like like the motivations and all that stuff is what it is, but it's also like I think it's actually really interesting. Like, I think that, like, maybe in a decade, somebody will be able to look back at it and write something interesting to look at it in a way that, like, the pain of it is not as immediate. So there might be a way to unpack that a little bit in a different way. And there's something that could be playful about it.
Yeah.
Not that she did it that way, right? So
she didn't do it with that intent.
But they're like, as an example of like, what does that mean? And
because she did it with the intent actually of passing.
Right, exactly.
And that's also complicated, right?
That's definitely race trading, right? Because, I mean, the idea of passing is usually passing into dominant culture with like the power structures, right? So, I mean, that's fascinating too.